What is up, my friends? I figured it's Monday night. We got a quiz on Wednesday, so why not, just do a little review. And you cannot imagine what I had to go through to try to figure out how to screencast on this school-issued laptop. But we made it work, so let's go through. I think what I'm going to do is go through the most maybe like complicated part and also the newest part. So this is like everything that we've done so far on this one slideshow, which is in the Unit 1 folder. So you can scroll through. I mean, we got old questions of the day, but it's got all the major information you need. It pretty much starts right here with John Locke and the reason for government. And I'm going to talk about this one right here. So I think maybe I was being a dum-dum and I shouldn't have done this chart where you're like filling in X's for parts of it. I should have just started with the questions and gone through there. So duly noted. I did talk a little bit about the differences between governments and economic systems, just because it's important to understand that if you say something like socialism, you're actually talking about a economic system, not a government system. So you can have democracies and socialism, you can have oligarchies and have capitalism. Anywho, the first question, and the whole purpose of this is just to categorize government. So if you were to say, what type of government does France have? There's a number of different ways of answering that. So you want to make sure that you clarify what you mean. So there's 3 different ways that political scientists generally classify governments. And the first characteristic is who can participate. So can I view this thing? Nope. Okay, so who can participate? So we're looking at how much direct authority does the government have, do the citizens have in running the government? So in a democracy, that's in the one far end of the spectrum, where you've got the authority rests on all the individuals of the nation, and all that means is that all the citizens participate in the governing. So everybody has a say in the decision. This doesn't happen in too many places. It's very, very difficult at some local levels in America, particularly Minnesota. You can find some township governments that have direct democracy, but it's very hard to do with a lot of people. So what normally will happen is you end up with this thing called a republic, or also called an indirect democracy. Again, they're slightly different, but I'm going to use them for our intents and purposes to mean the same thing. So in here, you still have citizen participation, but they're going to indirectly participate. Come on. Yes. They're going to, ooh, that makes it terrible. Anyway, they indirectly participate by electing representatives. So they've got these representatives that are directly doing the government, and the voters are voting in these people. So they have some say in the government as well. So that's where you're getting into kind of like the middle area, probably closer to the democracy side, but not quite direct democracy. And then finally, the last thing that we would characterize as would be, I kind of lump these together, but an oligarchy or an autocracy or a dictatorship. And those are different variations of the same thing. In an oligarchy, you're going to have a few people, usually like one political party, that's going to participate in the government, and no one else really has a say unless you're a member of that party. So China, for example, is the Communist Party has control of the government, always has since basically Mao Zedong back in the Cultural Revolution days. Autocracy is going to be where the government has the ultimate authority over the people. The people have very little authority. It's an authoritarian type of government. The most extreme case would be a dictatorship, where you just have one person that leads. So again, I just defined it like an oligarchy, but only a few people are able to participate in government. And this is kind of just the spectrum where you've got pretty much the most citizen participation on this side, and then the lowest amount of citizen participation on this side. So very few governments have direct democracy, and also fewer governments have an oligarchy or autocracy. There's a lot of developed governments that are sitting right in this area with the republic or the indirect democracy, such as the United States of America. The next way that you can classify governments is by how the power is distributed in that government between the national government and any other government's governing bodies. So the way we do this is we look at, are they a federalist, a unitary, or a confederate government? So in a unitary government, again, this is like the furthest end of the spectrum. You're going to have one central authority, one government. Doesn't mean that you don't have states or like cities. It's just that they don't have any of their own authority. So in America, the national government, the federal government has certain powers, and then the state government has certain powers. And that's why it's a federalist government. Whereas in some place like the UK or Britain, they might have cities, and those cities might have governments, but basically they have to listen to whatever the national government does. So unitary just means that there's one central government that has authority over the whole nation. Federalist government, power is shared. In a confederate government, which isn't too common, you have powers decentralized amongst various local or regional governments, and then the national government, if there is one, is very, very weak. Switzerland has one kind of like this, which is how they keep close, probably the closest to a direct democracy that they have or in the world. But most governments, if you look over here, the blue is unitary and the green is federalist governments. So they're kind of maybe about half and half. If you look in like Europe and Africa, you see a lot more unitary governments. Yeah, so that's the second way. And the third way, which I think tripped the most people up, was looking at the relationship between the legislative and the executive. So I defined the branches of government for you right there. So just make sure you know what they are. But in the two types of ways that we looked at are parliamentary and presidential. So in a parliamentary system, the legislature picks the executive, and then that executive kind of, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but pretty much just works for the legislature. So the legislature kind of has a little bit of the executive has a little bit of accountability to the legislative because they're part of the legislature. In a presidential, that's like the UK. In a presidential system, the executive branch, the people executing or carrying out the laws, are completely separate from the legislative. So they're not really accountable to one another. They have to work together, but they're not necessarily accountable, which means that the legislative doesn't really have any power over the executive. The executive doesn't really have any power over the legislative. Now in America, you probably know from like 7th grade or so that there's things called checks and balances. We're not talking about specifically America's system. They do build those things in, but in a general, in a presidential situation or presidential government, there's not necessarily accountability or checks between those two branches. So I hope that helps clarify things. If you have any questions, please email me. There's a couple things we did with like positives and negatives that we kind of brainstormed, and we'll get more into those as we go further in the course. But for our purposes right now, it's just good that you know what the definitions are and like what a government that follows that pattern would look like. All right, so there's the stuff for the quiz. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you later.